Welcome to what I believe is your first session of the conference. I will do my best to make it worthwhile for you. My name is Larry Cohen. I have been in practice since 1990. I lead a small clinic here in Washington, D.C. called Social Anxiety Help, because that is the main thing we focus on, although as you'll learn today, the large majority of people with social anxiety have at least one other mental health diagnosis, and therefore we work with a wide variety of problems, including people that don't have social anxiety, but that's our specialty. This session is being recorded so that it will, with permission from ADAA, of course, so that it will be posted later on the website of the National Social Anxiety Center, which I represent. I co-founded and have co-led the National Social Anxiety Center, NSAC, for the last 10 years since it began. We are a network of, at this point, 30 clinics around the country, including our own in DC, but all over the country. And we're a nonprofit educational organization geared toward promoting evidence-based, effective treatments for people with social anxiety. And we offer a wide variety of educational services, both for clinicians, such as pre-recorded training seminars like this one, and also for people with social anxiety. I don't have anything to disclose, although I do represent NSAC. I'm not paid by them, it's a volunteer position. There's a couple slides here with information that you may find useful. These are resources geared toward therapists, and a number of training manuals. I want to point out the last one is a link to the NSAC website, specifically the page of workshops and sessions that are available for you if you want to go more in depth. This session is just an hour and a half. We also have a 3-hour, and we'll soon have a 6-hour version of this on the website if you want more information. And this next slide are resources available for people with social anxiety. So these are things you can look for. I also want to point out the slides in this presentation are available for download, as well as a separate PDF of many handouts that you are free to use and adapt without attribution in your own practices. So ADAA sent you an email today and yesterday, I believe every day, that has a link to them. So just click onto Thursday, you'll find my name, click onto that, and you'll see 2 PDFs of the slides and handouts. This workshop focuses on the different approaches to what is commonly called exposure therapy. Broadly speaking, there are 3 different approaches that could be thought of as the so-called 3 waves of CBT. The traditional, original approach to exposure therapy, sometimes called exposure and response prevention, especially when treating OCD, but any other anxiety-related disorder, is using exposures aimed at habituation, both habituation within an exposure session so that one stays in the exposure until the anxiety goes down. Typically, the suggestion is by at least 50%, which means every minute or whatever, stating what the anxiety level is, the so-called SUDS rating, subjective units of discomfort scale, but also habituation between sessions so that over the course of time, the client experiences less and less anxiety. That's the traditional approach to exposure therapy. The cognitive behavioral therapy approach, or the traditional CBT approach, actually all of these really are CBT, but traditional sort of Beckian, whatever, CBT approach tends to call exposures behavioral experiments, and it's an adaptation of the scientific method where we approach our hot thoughts, in this case our anxious thoughts, as hypotheses to be tested, rather than things to be believed simply because they're in our head, which is how most people approach their thoughts, I imagine. but instead thinking of them as hypotheses to be tested. And so doing exposures is like doing a scientific experiment where you test out the hypothesis and gather evidence to see to what extent is it confirmed, disconfirmed, or need to be modified based on the evidence. Now I want to point out that traditional exposure therapy, sort of first wave therapy, is kind of moving up in recent years through the work of Michelle Kraske, especially into second wave CBT. So there is now an emphasis, she calls it inhibitory learning, which in my view is essentially the same as traditional CBT. It's basically using exposures not focused on habituation, as was traditionally done in exposure therapy, but focus on violating expectancy is her term, which basically means learning through experience, learning through the exposure that what we expect when we're anxious doesn't come true, or if it comes true, we can handle it much better than we had expected. And so traditional exposure therapy is now sort of moving into a second wave realm where you're using exposures not just for habituation, but with the main emphasis being learning, which essentially makes it the same. The language is different, but essentially makes it the same as traditional CBT, where you're doing exposures as behavioral experiments to test hypotheses, which are hot thoughts. And finally, third wave mindfulness-based therapies, in particular acceptance and commitment therapy, approaches exposures differently. It's not about habituation. It's not about learning, gathering evidence. It is about learning, but it's not about gathering evidence to challenge the content of our hot thoughts. It's about living your life according to your values, so avoiding avoidance, avoiding other safety-seeking behaviors, and focusing on living according to your values. And while doing so, to the extent you're having anxiety or other uncomfortable feelings, as well as uncomfortable thoughts, so-called hot thoughts, learning to diffuse from them while focusing mindfully on the exposure, on the activity in accordance with your values. So those are the three approaches. In many disorders, all three of these approaches have about the same effectiveness according to outcome studies, but social anxiety is different. So if you're approaching other phobias, social anxiety disorder is also called social phobia. If you're looking at other phobias, fear of heights or dogs or rats or what have you, it doesn't really matter which of the three approaches you're going to use. According to outcome studies anyways, you end up with about the same effectiveness. But that's not true with social anxiety. With social anxiety, those approaches that are focused on testing and modifying the content of our hot thoughts. I know this riles those of you that are really act purists. The content sometimes does matter. It matters for social anxiety. Why? Because people who are socially anxious believe the content. It is not an irrational fear. The things that people are socially anxious about, the fears that they have, are rational. The fear of judgment, the fear of rejection, the fear of embarrassment. Those things happen in life. They happen pretty often in life, at least in my life. It's not an irrational fear. So learning to test the content of our thoughts is really important. And that's probably why outcome studies show that CBT approaches to social anxiety are moderately more effective than the traditional exposure therapy aimed at habituation or third wave ACT approaches, which isn't true for other anxiety disorders. The two major elements of social anxiety, one obviously is anxiety based primarily on the fear of judgment or things like judgment, embarrassment, rejection, criticism. But what often gets neglected and is really important is social anxiety is also based on shame, negative core beliefs about our worth, about our value, shame. So it is not only an anxiety disorder, but if there were a category in the DSM for shame disorders, there isn't, but if there were, it would certainly be high in there. That's important. That's why social anxiety is different than the other phobias. Generally speaking, people with another phobia don't have shame. They may be embarrassed that they're afraid of things that other people are less afraid of, but they don't have inherently, based on their diagnosis of a specific phobia, they don't have a particular shame about themselves. They don't think of themselves as less than. But that is true with social anxiety. It's based on the core beliefs that we are in some way less than other people and less than what they expect. So it's important to address that as well. It's also important to note that diversity factors in social anxiety, such as racial factors, LGBT factors, gender issues, cultural and language factors like coming from another country and English being your second language might trigger a lot of anxiety. Physical appearance, people who are attractive according to a societal norm, whatever it is in a particular society. People who are less attractive often have social anxiety about their attractiveness, or at least who perceive themselves as being less attractive. Disabilities, personalities. In the US, because it's a society that values extroversion and tends to think of introversion as problematic, people who are introverted often have social anxiety about their personality, that it's not going to be viewed positively by others. So the point being is that the things that we're afraid of, or your clients are afraid of when they're socially anxious, are often rational. It's just that they're exaggerated. In their minds, it's exaggerated in multiple ways. One is they think that the feared rejection, criticism, embarrassment happens more often than it does. It's also exaggerated in terms of intensity. They think that it's worse when it happens than it really is. And it's exaggerated in terms of how well they can handle it. They think that they can't handle it as well as they really can. It's really minimized at that point. So in other words, part of what we're helping clients learn through doing exposures is, one, their fears don't come true as often as they think they do, but they do sometimes come true. When they come true, it's not as bad as they think it is. Why? Because they can handle it, and there are various ways they can handle it, which we'll be discussing. I want to go over some brief information about social anxiety. One is, in my view, it tends to be underestimated by clinicians, underestimated both in terms of frequency and severity. Social anxiety disorder, when I say social anxiety, I really mean social anxiety disorder. Social anxiety disorder is actually the third most, or second or third, or third or fourth, depending on survey, most frequent mental health disorder in the United States. It's actually less common in some other countries, but in the US it's quite common. I have some ideas as to why we're such an extroverted oriented culture, but nonetheless. And it is more severe than people think that it is. So that a lot of people think, okay, lots of people are a little bit shy, what's the big deal? Well, people with social anxiety disorder, 2 out of 3 of them have it severely or moderately. And what does that mean? It means that they're likely to do less well in school. They're likely to do less well in their careers. They're likely to do less well in their relational life, have fewer friends, and have less likely to have romantic relationships, romantic partnerships, marriages. They are less likely to have children. So there are, and they are much more likely to have other mental health problems. Some 2 out of 3 people with social anxiety disorder have at least one other mental health problem, most commonly depression or some other anxiety disorder, or both, and also have a higher rate of suicidality and a higher rate of alcohol dependence, sometimes other substances, but especially alcohol, because that is used to self-medicate social anxiety often. The good news is, all that's kind of bad news, of course. The good news is that CBT is highly effective. 2/3 to 3/4 of people undergoing CBT for social anxiety disorder recover, and they maintain their progress, often making progress on their own afterwards, because we're teaching them skills and strategies and concepts that they can and are encouraged to continue using on their own. One of the things I enjoy most in my career is periodically I get contacted by former clients to let me know how they're doing, and usually it's better than when I last saw them, which makes me wonder. But actually that's a positive thing. They're continuing to use the skills and strategies that they learned. Now, one other fact about social anxiety disorder that's important to note is that without treatment, it tends to be lifelong. You don't just grow out of it. Many small children do grow out of shyness, sure. But in adulthood, you don't just grow out of it. And it's more lifelong than other common mental health disorders. And so the question is, why is social anxiety disorder usually lifelong? When if you think about it, no matter how avoidant somebody might be who has social anxiety, they can't avoid every interaction, meaning that probably every day to some extent they're having exposures. And one would think, if I'm having exposures to the things that make me anxious, according to traditional exposure therapy, shouldn't I be making progress even without therapy because I'm not avoiding everything? Well, there are a few reasons why, on their own, people with social anxiety disorder tend not to make progress despite the daily exposures. One is that the thing that people are afraid of is usually invisible. Rejection, judgment, in adulthood anyways, certainly in adolescence, it may become very overt. But typically in adulthood, not always, but typically in adulthood, the things that we're afraid of that might happen with social anxiety are invisible. That's important because if someone is afraid of dogs or elevators crashing or planes crashing or whatever their other specific phobia might be, they know whether or not the dog bit them or the elevator crashed or not. It's clear. Now, it's not easy because it doesn't prove that the next time the dog won't bite them, but at least they know. But with social anxiety, often what will happen is people will say that, okay, this person was being nice to me, but I think they were still judging me. They were just being nice. Or the person yawned, and so maybe I was boring them. So we can't know what the other person is thinking, and even if someone tells us, gives us overt verbal feedback, which is not common, but sometimes happens on how we are coming across, often people with social anxiety disorder dismiss that as someone just being nice. Also, people with social anxiety, and this is true of other anxiety disorders, rely heavily on various safety-seeking behaviors. It's usually called safety behaviors. I prefer to call it safety-seeking because it doesn't really provide safety. Avoidance is the biggest one, but even if they're not avoiding, there's all sorts of safety-seeking behaviors that get in the way of a person learning from exposures that their fears are exaggerated and that they can handle them better than they think. And we'll discuss what kind of safety-seeking behaviors those are. Also, people with social anxiety tend to rely on internal feelings and thoughts as though that were evidence of how they're coming across. You know, what in traditional CBT is called emotional reasoning. The idea that if I'm feeling embarrassed, I did something to embarrass myself. Or if I'm feeling anxious, that means I'm not coming across well. So they take their feelings and thoughts as though it were evidence, and they tend to pay more attention to their feelings and thoughts than to external evidence. And finally, people with social anxiety disorder tend to ruminate on the negative. A very interesting study showed that two groups were given a socially anxious triggering task, which is giving a speech in front of a panel of judges with only like a minute of preparation. And the socially anxious group rated themselves more negatively than the non-socially anxious group. The socially anxious group also rated themselves more negatively than the judges rated them. But even more interesting than that was a month later, or however long later, they went back to the two groups and asked them, remember that time you had to speak in front of that panel of judges? How well do you think you did? The socially anxious group, a month or whatever later, thought they did even worse than they did right afterwards. Much worse than the judges thought they did. And guess what? The non-socially anxious group thought they did even better. So maybe they're ruminating on how great I am, God bless them. But more importantly for us, the socially anxious group tends to ruminate negatively on how well they came across. So an important part of social anxiety is rumination, worry, and so forth. There are many possible triggers for social anxiety. It's important to recognize that the word social and social anxiety is meant in the broadest sense. You could think of it as interpersonal anxiety. It's not only anxiety in social settings. It could be pee shyness, anxiety about urinating in a public bathroom where there are other people around, or even a one-person public bathroom where other people could be waiting. That's social anxiety. Sexual performance anxiety is social anxiety. Any anxiety based on the fear of judgment, the fear of embarrassment. The most common form, but it's not the most common of people seeking treatment, but the most common fear is the public speaking fear. In fact, Seinfeld has a great joke that according to surveys, I don't actually know that these surveys exist, but Seinfeld says they do. So according to surveys, the most frequent fear, the biggest fear in the United States is public speaking, even higher than the fear of death. He says, again, I don't know that he's correct, anyway, even higher than the fear of death. And his joke is that that means people would rather lie in the casket than stand up and give the eulogy. Also, people can be socially anxious by being observed. They don't have to directly be interacting, so it could simply be being in a public place, where others are around, walking when there are lots of pedestrians around, sitting in a cafe, whatever. Any time people are afraid of rejection, embarrassment, judgment, criticism. There's a lot of research related to social anxiety, which is, look at that, anyways, which is summarized on the National Social Anxiety website. There's a link. The main thing I want to stress is, as I said earlier, outcome studies show that any of the three approaches to CBT, first, second, or third wave, do well. But CBT traditionally, where you're challenging the content of the thoughts, does the best for social anxiety disorder, which makes social anxiety different than the other anxiety disorders where they are all more or less equally effective. Okay, so today's presentation is about how to do behavioral experiments, but also how to incorporate the key elements of the other approaches that are useful. One of them is mindfulness, but external mindfulness. Typically, when people talk about mindfulness, they really mean meditation. Mindfulness and meditation are not the same thing. Meditation is simply one way to practice mindfulness. But you could be mindful when you're washing your dishes. You could be mindful when you're walking down the street. Or for social anxiety purposes, in particular, you could be mindful when you're having a conversation that makes you anxious. I call that external mindfulness as opposed to internal mindfulness, which is meditation. Research shows that meditation alone, mindfulness meditation, is helpful for all sorts of things. So I'm not against it, but is less helpful for social anxiety disorder than a placebo. So have them meditate on a sugar pill. Meditation is not like, it's likely to help your clients with other things. So I'm not saying don't teach them that, but not for overcoming social anxiety. External mindfulness is the key, which is focusing basically on what the five senses are bringing in. Primarily what you see and hear, but it could also be what you taste, smell, and touch, depending on the circumstance. and diffusing. So this is stuff from third wave ACT and so forth, which is really important. Diffusing from it's usually called thought diffusion, but it's really thought and feeling diffusion. Diffusing from the thoughts and feelings that are making you anxious. So you're aware of the anxious feelings going on in your body. You're aware of the anxious verbal and imagery thoughts going on in your mind. But diffusing from them means basically treating them like background noise, something that you're aware of, but not focused on. What you're focused on instead is getting absorbed in, getting interested in the conversation or the other activity that's going on around you. Whereas people who are socially anxious tend to be very much in their heads rather than in the moment. So ways of introducing this, in fact, it says it here, is first of all, I introduce it with the slogan, get out of your head into the moment. Being in your head means focusing on your thoughts and feelings. Being in the moment means focusing on, with interest, with curiosity, as opposed to with judgment, focusing on what you're hearing and seeing, maybe tasting, smelling, and touching, but mainly hearing and seeing, okay? There are some important concepts to help introduce a client. One is that by focusing internally, although that really is a safety-seeking behavior, other than avoidance, internal self-focus is probably the most common safety-seeking behavior with social anxiety. And they're doing it not because they're narcissistic, they're doing it to the contrary because they think they're less than others, that's the shame piece, and they're afraid they're going to come across poorly. So it's a safety-seeking behavior, but it actually hurts how they come across. And that's one of the things we want to convey to clients, is that it hurts how you come across. You appear less interested. It hurts your conversational flow. If you're scripting, what do I say next, actually makes it hard for the conversation to flow naturally. And it sounds stilted and unnatural. And I use a couple analogies. One is, imagine being in a cafe with a friend on a beautiful day like today. And even if you're not at all socially anxious in that setting, there are all sorts of different sounds and sights, sometimes smells and so forth around you. And what we do naturally is focus just on the conversation and the food, perhaps. And when we get distracted by external sounds and sights, which occasionally we will, we naturally just bring our attention back to the conversation and the food. That's what we want to do with social anxiety. It's the same analogy. The other analogy, it's the same principle of focusing mindfully with interest on what's going on and diffusing from your thoughts and feelings. The other analogy is that I like to use is, imagine an actor on stage who's giving a performance, and naturally she would be very anxious about it, perhaps. Stage fright is a form of social anxiety. And imagine that what she's doing during the performance is focusing on how well she's performing. She's critiquing her performance in her mind while she's performing. I didn't say this line right, I didn't make the proper gestures at this time. The audience didn't respond the way I had hoped. All that stuff is, a running commentary, running critique of her performance while she's performing. And I'll ask the client, how do you imagine that would affect her performance? And even people that have zero experience in acting, they all say, it'll hurt her performance. Why? Because it distracts her from putting her full self into it. And then I say, that's what we do when we're socially anxious. We're having this running commentary critiquing how we think we're coming across, and we don't know, we're just making it up really based on negative core beliefs, but we're having this running commentary of how we think we're coming across while we're performing. So evaluating our performance while we're performing is not pure evaluation. It negatively affects how the performance goes. And so I say, what should the actor do? And any client will say, just get entirely into the role and save evaluation for later. Okay, so that's another way of introducing it. There's ways of training people in external mindfulness. I want to play something for you.
I don't know what to say. What do I say next? I'm coming across as so uninteresting, so boring as usual.
So I made a 10-minute
I gotta get out of
recording
this
years
conversation,
ago
or I'm just gonna feel
of
so
socially
stupid
anxious
again.
hot thoughts.
What is he thinking of me?
And one of the
How did I get
exercises
into
I
this?
do
I really
early
gotta
in
find a way
therapy
to leave.
is I have
I'm
this
so
playing,
nervous.
not
Why
so
am I so
loud, I don't know how to
nervous?
deal with the volume,
Other
but anyway, it's
people
not
are
so
so
loud, but I
nervous.
have
What's
this
the matter
playing.
with me?
And
You can
while
probably
it's
see that I'm
playing,
nervous.
I asked
She
the
can see that
client
I'm
either to have a
sweating.
conversation
Why am
with
I
me
sweating? It's not hot. She's gonna think
or
I'm
to
really
give a
weird and odd.
presentation, if that's the main
And I'm
thing they want to
blushing.
work on.
How embarrassing.
And I asked them
I shouldn't be
to
blushing.
treat those
My
hot
voice is
thoughts
quivering and
as
shaking, my
background noise,
hands
which
are
is what I
jittering.
hope
What do I
you're
do with
doing.
my
I hope you're
hands?
treating that
I
stuff
shouldn't
as
be in these
background noise
things.
while you focus
Oh, and I
on
shouldn't speak up
what
in
you're
front of
saying
meetings.
or what I'm
Then there's a
saying.
whole bunch of people looking at me. I don't know what to say. What do I say next? I'm coming across as so uninteresting, so boring as usual. I don't know what to say. What do I say next? I'm coming across as so...
I am a Mac person forced to use a PC. I don't know what's going on there. Okay. So that's just a way of introducing it. But then as homework, I give them, and by the way, all this stuff is in your handouts. I give them this sheet on the left that describes what mindfulness is, and they have two ways of practicing it. Mindfulness while observing, looking at various videos. By the way, I love musicals. There was a musical, I think the year before the pandemic, called Dear Evan Hansen. They recently made a less good movie out of it, but nonetheless, it's a musical about a socially anxious high school boy. It could be called Social Anxiety, the musical. And in it, there is a really good song early on called Waving Through a Window. You can just tell from that phrase what it means about his experience of being socially anxious. And so there's a link here, which in your handouts is clickable. There's a link here to a music video made of that where it's all acted out. So the person is using that not just to learn from the video, but it's because they already know that stuff, but they're using it as a way to practice external mindfulness. During a situation, the video is likely to raise feelings for them because they'll be able to relate to it in all likelihood. So it's a good way of practicing external mindfulness, but the most important way is practicing it during participation. I like to call this curiosity training because mindfulness means paying attention with curiosity, by taking interest, not by asking 20 questions, but taking interest in what you see and hear, maybe taste, smell, and touch as well. Taking interest in, as opposed to judging yourself or imagining how others are judging you. And then there's a worksheet where people can score how well they're doing. It's distorted here, but you'll have it in your handouts where you can use it. So that I ask people, like I just started a new group last night, and their homework is to practice this for at least 5 minutes a day. And the interesting thing is, a lot of people say, you mean I have to have a conversation for 5 minutes a day? A lot of people with social anxiety just don't, and that's part of the trigger for them. Part of the challenge for them is to figure out ways of having conversations and then practicing external mindfulness while they're doing that. Okay. As I alluded to earlier, there's a lot of debate of, are we challenging the content of the thought or just our relationship with the thought? In third wave therapy, say do not challenge content of the thought because that gives them too much weight and importance. You want to work on changing the way you relate to them, treating them as just passing ideas. The same thing with our feelings, accepting them, diffusing from them while focusing on valued behaviors. Problem is that it works less well with social anxiety. So the idea is with social anxiety, the way to take the best from both the second and third wave is that during an exposure, which I'd rather call a behavioral experiment, during an experiment, yes, focus mindfully on what you see and hear and diffuse from your thoughts. It's very third wave. But then afterwards, with the therapist or on your own using a worksheet, evaluate the evidence. You would never do that in that. Evaluate the evidence. What did you learn from that experiment related to your hot thoughts? How likely they are to come true? If they come true, how bad is it? And how well you can handle it if something negative were to happen. Okay, so that's the best. Oop, did it advance? Where am I now? Okay. There are all sorts of possible socially anxious hot thoughts. I just want to mention it happens in different ways. It could be about how we appear, both physically, how attractive we think we are, but also anxiety about anxiety. People with social anxiety are very often anxious about appearing anxious, which guess what? Makes you more anxious. I started a new group last night, my 99th social anxiety group. I started a new group last night, and one of the fellows in the group, when asked about his hot thoughts, said, I'm just anxious that I'm going to appear anxious. And so what do? I focus on my anxiety because I want to hide it. And how does that make you feel? More anxious. And that's super common. Now with him, it was more about tension. With other people like me, historically, I have a history of social anxiety that I've learned to overcome. For me, a lot of it had to do with blushing, long before I realized it was adorable that I blush. I used to have social anxiety about blushing, and a lot of people do. It could be social anxiety about sweating, social anxiety about appearing jittery, just the concern that we're going to appear anxious will tend to make people focus on their anxiety and then feel more anxious. And as I said earlier, we're aiming at habituation in the long run, but not in the short run. In traditional approaches, during an exposure, you would ask every minute or so, how anxious are you, using a SUD scale? I used to do that early in my practice, no more. I will ask them afterwards how anxious you were and stuff like that. And every week I give them a questionnaire, which you have a link to in the second from last slide, where people can evaluate the progress they're making, including on how anxious they feel. So we are aiming at habituation in the long run, but during an exposure, during an experiment, the focus as encouraged by third wave approaches, the focus is not on how anxious you are, because it only makes a socially anxious person more anxious to focus on that. The focus is on getting absorbed, getting lost, so to speak, in the conversation or the other activity that's going on, and then evaluating it afterwards. How we choose experiments is according to their values and goals. So that's another third wave-ish kind of approach. And so I tend to focus on goals, but values are important because they're ongoing and the goals simply reflect the values. And so if somebody is wanting to work primarily on public speaking, or someone else wanting to work on overcoming their anxiety using public bathrooms, or someone else is wanting to work on their anxiety making friends or dating, those are the things we would work on according to their values, the things that they're holding most important and goals they set for therapy. So we are using experiments to test their hot thoughts, but we're doing it individually, even in my groups. Each person chooses their own homework, which often varies greatly because they have different goals and different values. So I don't use the word assignment. I think, and I know there are a lot of prominent CBT people who use the word assignment all the time, and these are people I respect greatly, but I disagree with that. Don't use the word assignment. We don't assign it. We suggest it maybe. Once they get the hang of it, they make their own suggestions based on their own values and goals, what they want to work on. Experiments fall into two broad categories: straightforward experiments, which is usually what we start with, where they're, according to what their goals and values are, they're working on doing things that make them anxious. So if someone wants to work on making friends or meeting people to date, they might go to meetups or other social activities and do a series of straightforward experiments, such as introducing themselves to new people, trying to extend conversations longer rather than escape the conversation early, which is a common safety-seeking behavior. It might be sharing contact information, inviting that person out. So you could imagine a whole series of straightforward experiments helping the client work on their value of friendship or dating. Okay. But we also do paradoxical experiments. These are called different things by different people. I don't know why, but I started calling it paradoxical experiments years ago, the paradox being that we are trying to bring about the fear. We are trying to make the fear happen as a way of learning either that it's hard to make the fear come true, or if it does, it's not as bad as we think it is, and we can handle it better than we think we can. Other CBT leaders call them different things. Sometimes they're called shame-attacking experiments or social mishap experiments or decatastrophizing experiments, but they're all the same thing. Examples being, if you're anxious about blushing, make yourself blush. There's all sorts of ways to do it. I can exert myself and I'll blush. I can wear rouge. I can take vitamin B, which often has blushing as a side effect. So there are ways of, or you don't even do anything. Like I went with a client who had anxiety about blushing to a store, and she, interacted with a number of different customers and staff at the store, just asking about a product or whatever. And then out of nowhere, just after a sentence or two of that conversation, would say, "Don't mind me, I blush easily." So in other words, the paradox for her is she was drawing attention to her blushing, actually whether or not she was blushing, as a way of testing out. And what she learned, we did it like 25 times, what she learned is that most people said things like, "I didn't notice, I don't care, I blush too." Her saying that made any number of people blush, which was kind of funny. And only one person was critical at the end and gave this sort of scornful look, which actually led the two of us to start laughing, which I know is kind of rude, but it was just so funny that here, what she was learning is, yes, judgment might happen, but it's rare that most people don't care, don't see, or also experience the same issue. And that's an example of a paradoxical experiment.
Would that be, having clients say that, would that be more reassurance seeking? I've always thought of it that way. If they're saying like, "Oh, excuse me, I blush," or "I have social anxiety, so if I don't talk a whole lot, don't mind me."
Yeah, so that's a good point, and it's often raised. So that's an example of what I call a proactive assertion. Proactive meaning you're asserting yourself ahead of time, even if you don't know the person is reacting negatively to you. If you were to rely on that on an ongoing basis, yes, it would be problematic reassurance seeking. But we would do it in select experiments. She does not do this every day. This was like a couple different sessions we did this as a way of gathering evidence. But yes, it could become a safety-seeking behavior if you encourage the client to do that regularly. It's just meant as a way of gathering evidence. Other paradoxical experiments are getting rejected on purpose, which is surprisingly easy, at least. So it could be just going to a bar. This is very hard for people. In group, it's helpful because they tend to do it in pairs. Okay, let's split up, come back when we had 3 rejections or something. And the idea is not to say anything mean to people, because what do you learn by that? That if you say something mean, they'll reject you. We already know that. But instead, the idea is just to have an ordinary conversation, but the goal, the paradoxical goal is rejection, not acceptance. And typically what they learn is it's actually hard, that most of the time the conversations go well. And also when they do get rejected, which is rarely in a rude way, it's usually just someone showing disinterest, but when they do get rejected, they're a little bit relieved by it. It's like, oh, 1 down, only 2 more. So instead of feeling bad about it, they can feel like it's just an ordinary life experience. So those are examples of paradoxical experiments. In the handout, I have a list of like 50 of these, and clients could be very creative. Typically, we start with straightforward experiments because these paradoxical ones are really scary for clients at first. And usually, we have to do that on our own. Also, we do experiments both in session. That's what I meant about, typically we need to do experiments with clients in session. It might be through a role play. If you have other staff in your clinic, it might be using another staff person to be a stranger to talk to for them to practice with. It might also be going out in vivo, as I did at the store with that one client, and doing experiments with them there. Now you'll see that there are a number of clinical demonstrations that are referenced here. There are 10 free clinical demonstrations on the MSAC website. I will show one of them today. I don't have time for more than one, but all of them are available, and the link is in the last slide. Okay, and this is the first one. I just want to explain, this is a clinical demonstration about someone who is anxious about appearing anxious. What is the setting? I think it's giving a speech or giving a presentation at work. It is a role play. I am portraying the therapist as best I can, and the Shamin Ajan is our representative of our Brooklyn clinic. And so let's listen to that.
So Shamin, you tell me that you have a work meeting that you have to give a presentation at coming up this week.
Yeah,
And how are you feeling about that?
a little nervous. I think this is what makes me most nervous of all. So I worry that I'm gonna not be able to stay focused and stumble over my words, and that people are gonna think that I'm not prepared or smart enough to do the job.
Okay, and you've already made a lot of progress in your homework experiments in a social setting,
Right.
but this is a very different setting now. This is speaking at a staff meeting, and so it makes you more scared, you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, there's more at stake, I think, because it's my job and I see these people every day. So yeah, it makes me more nervous.
Okay, and so when you think about speaking at a staff meeting, tell me specifically, what are your fears? What are your feared predictions of how you will, or at least might, come across?
I'm afraid that I'm gonna come off as not sure or confident, because my voice is shaky and because I'm stumbling over my words, or I might lose my thoughts. I might lose track of my thoughts. I'm worried that I'm gonna sweat. That'll be really embarrassing.
Okay,
And I'm worried that I'll be shaking because I can't really hide my hands. I usually hide them or grab them or have my arms folded, but if I'm standing up in front of everybody and I have to do the PowerPoint and I have to stand there, then I can't really hide my hands as well.
and if all these fears, or even some of these fears, come true, what's your overarching concern about how others might react?
I think I worry that people are gonna judge me, that they're gonna not want me to do other projects, or I might get left out of stuff, or I mean, worst case scenario, I might lose my job because they don't think that I can do it, or that they'll think that I'm stupid, or that they won't want to work with me.
Okay, it sounds really hard.
It's really hard.
So let me go through your feared predictions, and I'm going to ask you, if you were doing an experiment here, in giving you the presentation you need to give at work next week, and you're doing it here, and how shaky do you imagine your voice would be, 0 to 100?
Probably like a 90.
Okay. And how much do you think you would stumble over your words, 0 to 100?
Probably a 90.
And lose track of your thoughts, what you were saying?
I always find the PowerPoints to help, but probably like a 85.
How about sweating? How badly might you sweat?
I'm gonna sweat. I know I'm gonna sweat. That's gonna be an 85 too. I'll probably wear black so they can't see it.
Okay, that's another safety-seeking behavior. And finally, hand shaking, 0 to 100, how bad would that be?
I feel like that's a 92, not 92, a 90 also.
Okay, okay. And you're concerned that all of these things will lead to you to be judged negatively by others as stupid, as not confident, as people that they don't want to work with, that you might even lose your job or at least not be included in future projects because of this.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, my suggestion is that we do an experiment in which you practice giving your work presentation or a part of it, and that we this time record it by video now. And then that we watch the video together afterwards, because the video provides evidence of how you actually came across, and we could see to what extent do your fears about how you will come across pan out, or do you come across any differently than you think? How do you feel about doing that experiment?
Okay, I can do that.
Okay, so let's set that up now. I'll turn on the video and you could begin your presentation.
Okay.
To the viewers, we would then have the client give a presentation while the video is being recorded, whether using Zoom for telehealth sessions or having a video camera or phone set up to record her speaking during in-person sessions. Well, congratulations, Shamin. That was really an interesting presentation. I learned a lot. Thank you.
Thanks.
So let me ask you, how did it feel for you?
Scary, not as scary as it normally feels because everybody wasn't there at work, but still scary.
Yeah.
But I got through it.
Okay, congratulations. Let me ask you about the specific concerns that you had. So before we watch the video, how much do you think your voice was shaking during the course of this presentation, 0 to 100?
Maybe an 80.
Okay. And how much do you feel you were stumbling over your words?
Same, around an 80.
Okay. How much did you lose track of your thoughts?
I know I did once or twice. I don't know, maybe 75, 80.
Okay. And how badly were you sweating?
I wasn't sweating as much as I thought. 70.
Okay. And lastly, how badly were your hands shaking?
I felt like my hands were shaking a lot. I'm gonna say 80.
Okay. So let's watch the video together. How do you feel about doing that?
Okay.
Watching videos of ourselves, it can be really scary. And I want to make a suggestion. Remember the concept of mindfulness, which means focusing with interest, with curiosity on what you see and hear, in this case, see and hear in the video, and diffusing from whatever thoughts and feelings that you're having in your mind and in your body. So in other words, when we watch this video together, pay close and curious attention, take interest in all that you see and all that you hear in the video. And to the extent that you're having any unpleasant thoughts or feelings while you're watching the video, just treat that like background noise.
Okay.
And return your attention to taking interest in what you see and hear in the video. Some people find it helpful to approach it like you're watching the video of a stranger rather than a video of yourself, so that you can see it more objectively.
Okay.
Okay, so let's watch the video together. To the viewer, sometimes it's useful to watch the video more than once, because if after the first time the client says that they were still really focused on their negative thoughts and feelings, I would suggest watching it a second time in which they treat those thoughts and feelings as background noise while
re-attending to what they see and hear in the video itself and taking interest in that rather than in their negative thoughts and feelings. Well, Shaman, having watched the video, let me ask you for your ratings again. In the video itself, how shaky, 0 to 100, would you say your voice was?
It wasn't as bad as I thought it was. Maybe a 40.
Okay, wow. And how badly did you stumble over your words in the video?
I mean, there were some moments where I stumbled, but it didn't take away from what I was saying, I don't think. I was still able to get my point across, so maybe a 45.
Okay. And in the video, how badly did you seem to lose your train of thought?
That did happen a couple of times, but I also was able to recover, I think, pretty well. And I don't think anybody would have noticed it. I noticed it because I knew it happened, but I don't think anybody else would notice it. So maybe a 40.
Okay. And how badly did you appear to be sweating in the video?
You couldn't tell I was sweating, I don't think. There was no like visible sign of me sweating. So I would say that was like a 10.
Okay. And lastly, in the video, how badly did your hands shake?
I could feel them shaking, but I couldn't see them shaking as much. I know they were shaking though. So I'm gonna say that was maybe a 50.
Okay, now this is really interesting. I've been writing all this down. Before doing the experiment, you predicted that your voice would shake at 90, and right after the experiment, but before watching the video, you thought it was shaking at 80. But when you watched the evidence within the video itself, it was only shaking at 40, less than half of your prediction.
Yeah.
And stumbling over your words, your initial prediction was 90, but watching yourself in the video, your score was only 45. Losing track of your thoughts, you predicted you would do that at 85, but watching the video was only 40. Sweating, you predicted would be 85, but you can only observe that at 10. That was a dramatic decrease. And handshaking, you predicted it at 80, and that went down to 50. So all your scores went down a lot, some of them very dramatically, but all a lot in watching yourself on the video. What do you make of that? What do you think we can learn from that?
I think that I believe that it's worse than it actually is. That, what I'm feeling is happening is not as obvious to others. You can't actually see some of this stuff in the same way that I can feel it. And that even if I make a mistake, that I'm able to pick myself up in the moment and get right back on track. So that's not noticeable as much as I thought either.
Wow, this was an important experiment. There was a lot that we learned from it. How we come across is much better than how we think we come across when we're anxious.
Yeah.
That's an important lesson to remind yourself of when you have anticipatory anxiety about giving this presentation this week or any other social anxiety experiment.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
A few notes to the viewer. Some clients, in watching the video together in session, will continue feeling that they came across badly. And so it will often be necessary to re-watch those portions of the video again where they think they came across badly, and to discuss each portion with them,
Because often they're seeing the video through the eyes of their hot thoughts rather than what they actually are seeing and hearing on the video itself. And watching it together with the client again will often help them see it more objectively. Another possibility that you can do, if there's another staff member around, or if you're doing this within group and within a social anxiety group and you have other clients around, is you can ask people to watch the video on their own and to rate on paper how they feel the client came across. And then after the client watches the video together with you, you can then show them the ratings of the other persons and see how other people also are seeing the client come across much better than the client had seen themselves. Then in the rest of the video, which I cannot get to, I ask her, so what do you learn from this? And basically what she says is that, one, I don't appear nearly as anxious as I thought I would, not nearly. But notice a couple of her fears did come true. She lost her place, train of thought a couple times. I asked her what she learned from that is that I recovered. It wasn't a big deal. And that's what we're helping clients to learn when we do behavioral experiments. It's not just whether or not their hot thoughts come true, because sometimes they do. And a lot of times, because of uncertainty, we just don't know whether or not they do. We don't know what the person is thinking. But also to learn that if they were to come true, we can handle it. It's not as bad as we think. And she handled this by just, resuming what she was saying last. Okay, so that's an example. One thing I forgot to say in the beginning, I want to say now, is if you have any questions at any point, just jump in. Yeah.
In terms of practical logistics, did you actually have her take a video of herself at her presentation? Or was this like a...
Well, this was an in-session experiment. If the setting allows for, usually they don't, but if the setting allows for being video, so if somebody wants to work on public speaking fear, Toastmasters is a good, almost free, not quite free, way to practice that. And usually, it depends on the meeting, but usually they'll let you video. So you can do that in some settings. In work settings, if it's on Zoom, maybe you can get it recorded if you ahead of time. But typically, the video recording experiment is done in session. Yeah.
So she seemed like a model client. She's
Yeah.
much better than mine. So I'm just wondering, I think for me, a lot of socially anxious patients are not very talkative, or like it's hard to draw out maybe what they're learning in the way that she just really gave it to you well. So I'm wondering how much sort of coaching you do to try to point them towards what you want them to notice, or do you not?
I don't, it depends what you mean by coaching. I try not to tell them I'm seeking a specific answer, because it makes it all look very fake and actually tends to make them anxious, like I'm getting it wrong. Okay, I just ask them a series of questions. I give them information. So you predicted that you would be 90% trembling, but you ended up 45% trembling. What does that mean? Anybody would say, well, I trembled less than I thought I would. Okay, that's important information. And you predict. So I ask very specific questions and lay out the evidence, and people give that information. So that's typically the case. The harder problem is not what you're saying. The harder problem, which I address in the latter part of this video that I don't want to try to get to, the harder problem is that if people watch the video on their own, which I have to have them do with group because we don't have time to go through all this, they very often see things that are just different than what are actually in the video. And even if they watch it with you, they may say, oh yeah, look how horrible I look. Really? And so we'll often need to watch certain parts of it a second time or a third time. Like, what do you think was happening there? Well, I thought my hands were trembling. Well, let's zoom in and let's take a look at that. And so again, I want to be careful that I'm not leading them to a specific answer, because then they have, one is they might get annoyed at me, but rightfully, frankly, but also they might become anxious that they're not performing well enough to please me, and that's not the point. It's by giving, by identifying the evidence, helping them identify the evidence and what they can learn from it.
So you kind of started to answer this question, I think, in what you just shared, but have you ever had an instance where somebody perhaps did appear very anxious in the video?
Oh, sure.
And they rated themselves at maybe just as highly or higher post-watching? And how do you?
Yeah, so what happens commonly is that people might rely on safety-seeking behaviors, and that's actually how socially anxious people tend to come across badly when they do, is through the reliance on safety-seeking behavior. So they might notice, it didn't happen in this video, but they might notice I was looking down a lot, or I was looking at the PowerPoint all the time. So okay, so let's try this again where you're not looking. We may have to do it the next session, but let's try this again where you're only glancing at the PowerPoint, or you're looking up at the audience, that kind of thing. So one of the nice things is that it's not, video evidence is not just aimed at helping people see that they come across better than they do, but it's also helping them see how safety behaviors hurt the way they come across. And the nice thing about that is that's changeable. That's changeable. So here's a worksheet that people can use in watching the video. It asks how they come across in a variety of ways before watching the video, and the same set of questions afterwards. Again, I would only use, and this is for homework, but I would only use this after they've done the video experiment with you in person, and watch the video together with you in person so you can walk them through the process. And the reason for this color chart, which is from a paint company, is if people are anxious about blushing, the way to predict it, one way to predict it is to ask them, what color do you think you appear? And it's usually way down here. And then ask them watching the video, what color did you actually appear? It's usually way up here. Okay. Like with any exposure work, the idea is to help a client identify their safety-seeking behavior, some of which they'll know right away. Like she mentioned, you know, I keep my hands together or whatever, I'm looking at the PowerPoint a lot or whatever. Or for people in conversational settings, it might be I cut the conversation short, or I speak very briefly. You know, the expression, it's like pulling teeth talking to someone. That someone is probably socially anxious, because often a socially anxious person will speak very briefly. And so help a client before doing experiments, including especially actually homework experiments, to identify their safety-seeking behaviors. And during the experiment, the idea is not only to focus mindfully on what's actually going on, but to try to drop the safety-seeking behaviors. Then often in the next session after when the experiment is being discussed, often what they'll learn is, oh yeah, I discovered another safety-seeking behavior that I was using. So next time, let's try doing it without that. Because when they're relying on safety-seeking behaviors, one is it tends to hurt how they come across, which makes their fear more likely to come true. But the other thing is that it tends to hurt the learning. Because even if it comes across really well, they tend to credit the safety-seeking behavior. They say, oh, it came across really well because, for example, I prepared for 3 hours for this 5-minute presentation. Well, how about next time if you prepare just for 5 minutes for the, or 10 minutes for the 5-minute presentation? Yeah.
Do you consider a client who's like anxious in conversations preparing like questions beforehand as safety seeking, or?
Yes, 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 yes. And there are all sorts of self-help books that tell people to do that. No, 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 no. So I call that scripting, and people script at different levels, whether it's preparing ahead of time things to bring up, or in their mind while the conversation is going on, they're scripting ahead of time what the next sentence will be. And I could do experiments with them to help, you know, try doing, in fact, we do an experiment with them of do that. There's a ghost in this computer. We do experiments where we practice, and again, there's a clinical demonstration here showing this. Experiments where I have a client, okay, let's rely on scripting and see how that goes. And we have a 10-minute or 5-minute conversation where they're doing a lot of scripting, and it's awkward and uncomfortable for them. And then we say, okay, try to let go of that and try to just get lost in the conversation, which means mindful. And then usually they're able to say, oh, it went much better. And we might do that on video, or even just doing it in session without a video. Yeah.
So what we're seeing in the video is helping the person see how likely or unlikely it is that her physical sensations are her behavior is as bad as she thinks, do you have them try to observe audience reactions to see if people do look disinterested or judging? That sort of
Right, right. It's just that that's unlikely to be able to be exercised in a in-session experiment unless you have an audience, but they could certainly do that for homework experiments. So there is a worksheet, what I'll show you in a minute, where they are making predictions which might include how people will react to them. It's just in this experiment, there's no way to really do that.
Thank you.
One of the debates is whether or not socially anxious people are socially anxious because they are socially underskilled. The short answer is no, and that's really important. That with the exception, there are some exceptions, certainly people on the autism spectrum, but leaving aside those exceptions, which are a small percentage of people, people with social anxiety disorder are in the normal range of social skills. And so traditional therapies that are focused on teaching people social skills are less effective. They're somewhat effective because there's a lot of exposure that happens when you have a social skills group. But the skills they actually know, and often a client will come to you and ask you to be their safety-seeking behavior for them and say, can you teach me how, I have people say, can you teach me how to flirt? So this is my expertise. But anyway, can you teach me how to flirt? Or can you teach me how to start a conversation with someone? Or can you teach me how to end the conversation? Or teach me how to invite somebody out once I've had a decent conversation with them? Resist answering them directly. The way I answer them is, how do you think you might do that? I mean, I'll usually say something self-offensive, like, well, I have some ideas, I have no idea if they're right. What do you think? And they have ideas. Now, rarely, occasionally, people come up with ideas that you might need to challenge, but that's actually very rare. Usually they have ideas, it's just they're afraid of doing it. So it's not the lack of social skills. Again, people on the autism spectrum, and there are some, and if you're dealing with teenagers, you might need to do some social skill training because they just haven't experiences before, but seldom with adults. Okay. The main thing I want to stress before experiments is you would have them fill out an experiment worksheet. And here's a sample one filled out, and you have a blank one in your handouts. And they fill out the first 3 columns before, where they're identifying the experiment they want to do. So it might be going to a party or social activity of some sort where they know a few people. They identify their negative predictions, their hot thoughts. So it's very much the scientific method. And they identify the experiment itself, what they want to do, which always includes external mindfulness. Focus on that, but it might include introduce yourself to a few people, extend the conversation for 10 minutes when possible, that kind of thing. So they identify behavioral goals of what they want to do that counter their safety-seeking behaviors and are an alternative to their safety-seeking behaviors. Then after the experiment, once a client has done this a few times, they can do this on their own as homework. And then afterwards, they identify the evidence that they gathered, and that's where you can get into things like how did people actually react to you, and so forth. And they identify what they can learn from the situation. So this is a structure that I use in helping people initially together in session, and then they do it as homework and bring it in for session to help people learn. Now there is, from behavioral experiments, there is an alternative. There's a bit of controversy on this, and I take a kind of flexible view. There's a question of should we help clients do cognitive restructuring, also known as reframing, before an experiment, before an exposure, to lessen their anxiety. And early models of CBT for social anxiety had people do this, and since I started a long time ago, I was doing this regularly with clients, like you would with depression. Whereas other models, more recent models, actually not that recent, but since the 90s anyways, like David Clark's model, which is mainly what I'm presenting on here, who is a speaker at some point today, by the way, from Oxford. I strongly suggest going to his session. I don't remember when it is. But other models say actually doing cognitive restructuring first, ironically, is kind of a safety-seeking behavior because you're lessening their anxiety when you really want them to test it out. The way I approach it is I start out by teaching people, and again, there's some controversy on this, but I'll just tell you what I do. I start out by teaching people cognitive restructuring because most of these people are depressed too. They may not be full-fledged major depression, but they have some depression problems, and cognitive restructuring is really useful for depression. And also, even if they're not depressed, they tend to ruminate afterwards, and cognitive restructuring is really good to counter rumination. So I do teach them cognitive restructuring, but as quickly as possible, which is usually within 2 or 3 sessions, if not by the very next session, I have them leave that aside whenever possible and go right into the experiment, only doing this worksheet where you're not actually challenging the content of the hot thought until you've done the experiment and gathered evidence, as opposed to doing cognitive restructuring first, where you're challenging the content of the hot thought, logically before the experiment. So generally speaking, I do teach cognitive restructuring because it's a useful skill to counteract rumination, to counteract depression, both of which are likely problems with social anxiety, but also it's a useful skill. It increases the likelihood that they will follow through. If there's an experiment they really want to do, but they're super scared about doing it, usually I encourage them to do another experiment first. But if they really want to do it that week, I say, okay, let's do cognitive restructuring together to lower the fear level. Cognitive restructuring is effective, but it's not that effective. It won't eliminate all their anxiety. It'll reduce it by maybe 1/3 or half, depending. And so it's an optional technique that I don't use with everyone. During experiments, the key is focus mindfully on what's going on, of course. That's the main thing. If they're having difficulty, I'll often encourage them to take a cognitive restructuring break, go to the bathroom and think through what's a more realistic and helpful way to think about this situation, what's the specific behavioral goals, and go back out of the bathroom and work on those. So those are the kinds of things we do during experiment, but it's mainly focusing mindfully, externally on what's going on and working on doing their goals, like starting conversations with new people. And then after the experiment, using the follow-up worksheet to help them identify what was the evidence they gathered related to their hot thoughts. Not only whether or not their hot thoughts came true, but also how, if they did come true, how difficult it was and how well did they handle it. And what they can learn from the experiment as a whole. There are various ways of increasing follow-through with experiments. One is by doing the experiment in a role play, in-session exposure, it's sometimes called, in the therapy session itself, or by doing experiments with them together with a stranger in a public setting, like a store or someplace where maybe you're the one doing it first, and then the client is by your side, which often is very anxiety triggering for them anyway. Then you're by their side while they do the experiment. So using imagery as a way to prepare them to do the experiment so that they're imagining doing the experiment before they actually do it. There are virtual reality programs, I don't use them, that do work on some forms of social anxiety. All of these are really aimed at helping a client be prepared to do experiments on their own as homework. Occasionally, you can do surveys as experiments. So if somebody is afraid, what do people think about, like I had a survey of a guy who was very anxious about taking a long time to pee in public bathrooms. I said, well, let's do a survey, let's find out. And so I asked the client to identify a specific question, which is, what do you think when you notice somebody taking a long time to urinate in a row of urinals? It could also be women in stalls and so forth. And I sent it, the client would rarely do this on their own. It's the trouble with surveys, you usually have to do this for them, but you're gathering evidence. So I sent it out to all my male friends and the question without the client's name, obviously, and got back like 20 answers of people thinking like, do you think I'm watching this? I think the weird thing is that I would be observing that, or I would just think this person has an enlarged prostate, or I would not care, or I would not notice, whatever. And that was actually very surprising to the client to learn that. And then mainly the point of surveys is it's kind of a form of cognitive restructuring. It's an experiment where you're gathering evidence to challenge their hot thoughts so they can then go out and do the experiment on their own. And there's a bunch of surveys, there's a link here that David Clark of Oxford has on his website that you can use. Okay, one strategy that is fostered primarily by Christine Podesky, is using assertions. Assertive defense of the self is what she calls it. I call it head held high assertions, non-defensive assertions, to help a client respond when their fears come true. Now, I mentioned earlier a proactive assertion, which if used too much would be a reassurance seeking, like, don't mind me, I blush easily. But they could also practice using assertions when negative things happen. We practice them in role play, so if like their fear is they say something stupid, you can imagine, do a role play in which a stranger criticizes them for saying something stupid, and their head held high assertion, I mean, everyone has their own answer, might be, yeah, that was a kind of silly thing to say, but we all do that from time to time, don't we? That would be an example. The limitation of this strategy is that, again, most of the time our fears are invisible and don't come true. Unless, as I remember in adolescence, decades and decades ago, it tends to happen often in adolescence. People voice what they think, probably more often than adults do. Donald Trump does, but typically, but nonetheless. So the assertion strategy helps in some settings, but a lot of clients will say, well, this doesn't usually happen. It's just I fear that that's what the person's thinking. Christine Podesky encourages you to do role plays on that anyways, as though the person is actually criticizing, and at least for some clients that's helpful. Other clients dismiss that as just unrealistic. That's not what I'm afraid of. I'm afraid of thinking it. If somebody were rude enough to actually say it, I wouldn't care as much because I think that's a rude person, which I think is a good attitude. It's the polite people who are thinking badly of me that I'm afraid of. So that's where I think that's an example of where cognitive restructuring comes in handy, which is if somebody wants to think that way of me, that's none of my business. And RuPaul likes to say that what other people think of me is none of my business. So there are ways of challenging our negative thoughts using cognitive restructuring when assertion doesn't work. And here's instructions on how to use the assertion strategy. And there's a really good clinical demonstration that allows you to watch it in practice. Here's an example of a worksheet that I use with assertions and how they are used. There's also some debate as to whether or not to target core beliefs or underlying assumptions. I kind of mushed them together. I know they're not exactly the same, but I think the distinction isn't terribly useful. Okay, there's a debate on that. And typically, in approaches to cognitive behavioral therapy or acceptance and commitment therapy, you're not targeting the core beliefs at all. But in CBT, traditionally you do. You start with the hot thoughts, the immediate, explicit, automatic thoughts that enter their mind, which are usually the fear that they're going to come across badly or that the person will react badly to them. But as they start making progress, and I don't get into core beliefs until they've started making progress, we do a number of things to help them identify what are the underlying core beliefs. And typically, the underlying core beliefs have to do with a sense of personal deficiency. That's where the shame component, in addition to the anxiety component, is about a fear that something bad will happen. The shame component is the core beliefs that say there's something wrong with me. I'm not as good as others. I'm not good enough. And so doing experiments to target that is really important. And that's something that only CBT as such does. Again, ACT would teach you to just treat that as background noise, to recognize it, accept it, diffuse from it as a passing idea while living according to your values. I'm all in favor of that. But it's useful to challenge it directly. And we can do that in a series of experiments as well. Here are examples of worksheets to help people identify their core beliefs. peeling the onion, often called the downward arrow technique for obvious reasons, as well as a questionnaire of common core beliefs. Again, you'll get these handouts. These are examples from former clients of mine who gave me permission to circulate their work on identifying core beliefs. And again, the theme is often that I'm not good enough to be liked. And that tends to be infused by implicit perfectionism. Socially anxious people tend to be perfectionistic. Not necessarily that they expect themselves to be perfect, although sometimes it's that, but all or nothing thinking, perfectionistic in the black and white all or nothing sense, meaning that if I don't handle things as well as I think I should, even if my standard isn't perfect, even if my standard is here, but if I only handle it this well, then that means I'm going to be rejected and humiliated. And so experiments to challenge that are, and they're paradoxical experiments, are to purposely handle it this well rather than this well, and test out what happens in real life setting. And generally, in real life settings, what happens is no one cares, no one seems to notice.
I actually have 3 questions on it really quick. How much psychoeducation do you use? That would be one. Versus, since I'm an ad therapist, I'm kind of trying to switch my thinking here a little bit with this. 2, is there a genetic component to this? It doesn't seem it, since it falls under social. I would often wonder about that. And then 3, individual versus group settings. What works best, combination or psychoeducation?
Oh, yeah.
Sorry.
I appreciate that. Yes, I do psychoeducation. I try to do that in small snippets, so I'm not giving lectures. And I try to do it whenever possible, as we discussed earlier, by asking questions. What can you learn? Here's the evidence, what can you learn from it? So that's them coming up with the information, but I'll throw in psychoed here and there, but in small snippets. But it's best that they discover things on their own with your help and guidance through what Christine Podesky calls guided discovery, or is often called Socratic questioning. With regard to group or individual, again, I'm leading my 99th social anxiety group now. I certainly believe in group. Honestly, the outcome studies show that group is a little less effective than individuals, so we work with individuals too. The advantage of group is it's cheaper, so they're very popular. It's cheaper for people. They make friends in the process. They can do some experiments together with other people that they wouldn't do otherwise. So there are some people that blossom in group that didn't do as well individually. But generally speaking, individual tends to be a little more effective because you can gear things more naturally for them. And there was another question that I forgot. But,
Genetic piece.
oh, yeah, there's evidence, I don't know the details of this, but there's evidence that maybe a third of it is genetically based, but that most of it is learned. So their anxiety tends to run in family, but what kind of things that people are anxious about often varies a lot, person to person. Yeah. And once people have identified their core beliefs, I use this worksheet called Core Belief Action Plan to help them identify experiments they can do, some of which are paradoxical, some of which are straightforward, to test out their core beliefs. There's a great strategy called then versus now. He calls it, David Clark calls it stimulus discrimination training, but also then versus now, to help people identify how the evidence now, this is done later in session, but how the evidence that they're gathering now from experiments that they've done for a while, so you don't introduce this early on, but the evidence is different from how they imagined it before. Most people with social anxiety experience social trauma, not physical trauma, so it doesn't meet the criteria of PTSD, that's not my point. But social trauma in the loose sense of humiliation, embarrassment, rejection, in childhood or adolescence that was very painful, and they tend to believe that things now in adulthood are just like they were then. And so this is a technique, again, there's a clinical demonstration of how this goes, but a technique to help people gather evidence of how things are actually different now than they were then.
If you're working, I don't know if you work with children and adolescents, but if you are working with those that do have a history of
Yes.
say they're still out of the situation, so it's not active, do you do anything special in order, like helping them process that, or?
Yeah, so that's an example. So part of it is cognitive restructuring to help people realize that bullying, or even if it doesn't meet that criteria, but just sort of saying critical and mean things to people in adulthood and so forth, I guess that is bullying. But nonetheless, that is a reflection of the other person. In fact, with the rejection generally, this goes beyond bullying. One of the things that I want to help people learn is that when you're rejected or treated badly, that's a reflection of the other person. It may simply be a rejection of their taste, a reflection of their taste. You know, if they reject you, that doesn't mean there's something wrong with you, it just means they have different tastes than you are. But if they're treating you badly, that says something about them as a person and their character and their personal problems as opposed to you. So that piece is cognitive restructuring. Yeah.
Amazing session. I've really enjoyed listening to all of it and how you integrated the different components. And one thing I'm really thinking about is the focus during exposures on mindfulness and acceptance, but still doing the predictions, and then afterwards getting people to rate them. And how hard is it for them to not be thinking about how much am I going to shake, because you're going to ask me the number for how much I shook. Yet in the exposure, focus on, okay, I'm going to be curious and mindful and just really focus on the conversation and not on my shaking.
Right. So that's very good. And certainly in a pure act approach, they say that's why we shouldn't be identifying, or at least one of the reasons why we shouldn't be worrying about the content of our thoughts is that we tend to focus on that. And there's some truth to that. That is a challenge. But I like to foster the idea of good enough mindfulness, that 75% is good enough. That if you are overwhelmingly focused on the conversation, but you occasionally get distracted by a concern in your mind, that's fine as long as you recognize that distraction and return your attention back to the conversation or the activity in the moment. And with practice, they get better at that, partly because they realize it lowers their anxiety. ACT likes to say that we shouldn't worry about how much anxiety someone has, just accept it. My feeling is, by doing ACT, their anxiety goes down, and so it helps clients learn that it will reduce their anxiety, which is an incentive. Okay, I just want to point out that we are done. So this slide has a couple scales that are used before and after therapy, but also a shorter one that's used at every session. And this last slide has a list of the 10 clinical demonstrations and the link where they are located. Thank you very much, everyone.